Okay, so let's get started with chapter 12. We're going to introduce the nervous system and then go over handout 12A. So, chapter 12 is an introduction to our nervous system, and we're going to start off by differentiating the nervous system into its different components. So, if you look here, it says the nervous system consists of the brain, spinal cord, nerves, and all of our sensory receptors. And that's what we're going to be talking about over the next 4 chapters to end the semester. So the nervous system is responsible for our senses, so perceiving sensory perceptions, our mental activities. It also tells our skeletal muscles to move, and it will signal the secretions of many glands, both products and hormones alike. Now, the nervous system is broken into 2 major parts, and we're going to introduce those parts in this video and then introduce to you the first handout. So, the 2 subdivisions of our nervous system are the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and spinal cord. I still have to fix that. That's misspelled. It's not a chord like music. It's a chord, C-O-R-D. But anyway, the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. And then the second part is our peripheral nervous system, which is made up of basically everything else. All of our nerves, the sensory receptors, anything that's coming off of the brain or off of the spinal cord. Now, the central nervous system is made up of just the brain, remember, and just the spinal cord. So all of these yellow accessory structures that you see on this picture, those are all not part of the central nervous system. It's just the brain and spinal cord. Now, one of the interesting things about the brain and spinal cord is that they're actually one thing. So it says they are continuous with each other. We just change the name of the structure as it leaves our skull. So as it goes out of that foramen magnum, we change the name from the brain to the spinal cord. But it's really all the same thing. It's all attached, and it's all basically one organ. The peripheral nervous system is a little bit more complicated. It's broken into different subsections or subcategories. When we look at the nerves of our body, we're going to have 2 major kinds. We're going to have the sensory nerves, and we're going to have motor nerves. Sensory is going to go from the body to the brain. Sometimes we call it afferent. And then the motor is going to go from the brain to the body. So that's important to know. Sensory is from body to brain. Motor is from brain to body. Sensory is pretty straightforward. We're going to receive information from our body, send it up to our brain. Motor is a little more complicated. It's subdivided into several parts. So it says the divisions of the motor nervous system is going to be the somatic. Somatic means what you can control. We can control our somatic nervous system. So in other words, to wiggle your toes, you consciously send a signal to the muscles. That's somatic. Then we have autonomic. Autonomic is those activities that we do that we don't consciously think of, like breathing or heart rate. Now, the autonomic, and we've seen these words before, they're broken into 2 subcategories themselves, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, sympathetic and parasympathetic are basically opposites. So what one does, the other does the opposite. So I have speed up and slow down. Well, this is a good example because we can think of our heart. So the sympathetic nervous system is going to speed up our heart. And so if the sympathetic nervous system speeds up our heart, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to slow it down. And so we have the opposites occurring with sympathetic and parasympathetic. So make sure you know these different subdivisions. And let's put an example here. All right, so I'm actually going to go to a different screen so that I'm not blocking this diagram. So let's look at this diagram and kind of put it all together. So this, I really like this, although I always joke in class that this is a bad example just because our stimulus is a bear and you should never run from a bear. But that's beside the point. Okay, so let's imagine that this guy is walking in the woods and he comes across a bear. All right, now his sensory nervous system in the peripheral nervous system is going to pick up the bear. So he is going to have sensory signals that are going to pick up the bear. Maybe he sees the bear, smells the bear. I don't know if he's going to touch the bear. He might hear the bear, probably won't taste it, but these are all the senses, right? So he's going to see, touch, taste, smell, hear. He's going to sense the bear. That is the peripheral nervous system. So we have sensory input going into his nervous system. So that sensory input's going to go from the body to the brain, and then his central nervous system, his brain and spinal cord, are going to pick that up. So his spinal cord is going to deliver this information to his brain, and he's going to process that information. Now, once he processes that information, he has to make a decision on what to do. He's going to make a conscious or somatic decision, and his body is also going to kick in and send information to his body that's autonomic. So he made a bad choice and decided to run, because you shouldn't run from a bear. But when he made that decision, his brain is going to send a motor signal to the muscles of his body, and that is going to cause him to run. Now, at the same time, his autonomic nervous system is going to kick in, and he's going to speed up his heart. He's going to constrict his blood vessels. He's going to secrete adrenaline. He's going to increase his respiration as he's running. So this is just a good example of how the nervous system is organized. Okay, so let's get into our first handout, which is going to be well, actually our first 4 handouts. Most of the handouts in this chapter, honestly, are just going to be talking about the cells of our nervous system. So the tissues are made of cells, and these are very specialized cells. Nervous tissue is one of our 4 major types of tissue. I think I mentioned this with muscle back in chapter 10. Chapter 10 has muscle, and it's its own type of tissue. Well, so is nervous tissue. Remember, we only have 4 types of tissue. We have epithelium, which is basically like the coverings of our body. We have connective tissue that holds everything together. Then we have muscle and nerve. So we have 4 different types of tissue. And so we have a lot of different cells that correspond with the nervous tissue. So let's go to our first handout. And these handouts are going to talk about the different types of cells that we find in our nervous system. So like I said, chapter 12 is really an introduction to the nervous system. And then when we get to 13, 14, and 17, we'll talk more specifically about stuff. So here we have our Handout 12A. And Handout 12A is going to talk about one of the major types of cells that we find in our nervous system called the neuron. All right. So there are two kind of categories of cells. We have neurons, and then we have these cells called glial cells or neuroglial cells. Neurons are the main workers. They're going to be the ones that are transferring those action potentials. And neurons build the highways that make our nerves. These other cells that are going to be in the other handouts, 12B, C, and D, they are what are called glial or neuroglial cells. And these cells are going to be helper cells. They're going to be structural cells. They're going to be aiding and helping the neurons move their action potentials. All right, so let's introduce the neuron first. And so it says our neurons are made of three parts. They're a funny looking cell. You can see this is a picture of the cell right here. So it's going to have these dendrites, all these branches coming off of the cell. Those are called dendrites. They're going to carry impulses toward the cell body. So an action potential is going to reach this cell, go through the dendrite into the cell body. It says they're highly branched. So you can see all of these dendrites are highly branched. The second part of the neuron is the cell body itself, and it's going to contain the nucleus and all the other organelles, and it's going to transmit that action potential through it into what's called this axon hillock, which is this connector to the third part of our cell called an axon. Axons, it says, are going to carry impulses away from the cell body. They may have branches, and you can see that there's a branch on this right up here where they can branch off. And those branches are called collaterals. And then they are going to end at what we call synaptic inbulbs. Now, we've seen these in chapter 20. This was the end of the nerve at the neuromuscular junction. This was the end of the neuromuscular junction, or I should say the end of the nerve at the neuromuscular junction. And so we've seen this. So what's going to happen is our nerves are built out of millions of neurons that are connected. So you've got one neuron connecting to a second neuron, connecting to a third, and so on. So let me just give you an example here. So here's my dendrites. All right, I'm just going to draw dendrites. Here's the cell body. And then you have this long axon with these synaptic inbulbs. And then the next cell is going to be attached like this. And so your nerves are made out of millions of neurons that have a dendrite and an axon that are going to receive information. Now, most action potentials can only move in one direction through this neuron. All right? So the neurons are the main component of our nerve. They're moving the action potentials. Now, we do have, and this is small, and I apologize for how small it is. I'll zoom in. We do have some different types of neurons. We have our typical type called a, hold on one second. There we go. We have a typical neuron that I just mentioned. It's called a multipolar, where we've got a highly branched dendrite, and then we have our cell body, and then we have a long axon. That's called a multipolar. This is typical. This is what we're really going to focus on this chapter. But just so that you know, we have some other types of neurons. We have bipolar neurons. Bipolar neurons are going to have one main dendrite. It's branched, but see how it's one main dendrite? It's going to have a cell body and then an axon. So it's bipolar. It only has two big components to it. And then we have a unipolar, which has the dendrite and axon basically connected right to each other, with that cell body off of the main pathway of the action potential. Now, these are pretty rare, but they exist in our special senses. And so you'll see that, like, for example, bipolar neurons are found in the retina of your eye. And so you'll see these in your special senses, like eyes, ears, taste, that kind of thing. But your typical nerve that's going to be moving information, the neurons in your brain, the neurons in your spinal cord, most of those are these multipolar neurons. All right, and then down here I just have the different types of neurons. And you need to realize that we have basically two major types of neurons. We have sensory and we have motor. Sensory, sometimes called afferent. Remember, it's always body to brain. Motor, efferent, are brain to body. So you can imagine, like, our spinal cord is made up of both sensory and motor neurons. These are one-way streets too. So sensory only move from body to brain. Motor only moves from brain to body. Then our brain itself are made out of these specialized neurons called interneurons, which allow information to move from one part of your brain to another. So I just wrote brain to brain. And so those are the different types of neurons. All right. And so the neurons make up most of our nervous system. But for the next couple of handouts, we're going to talk about these other cells that are going to help the neuron move that action potential. So we will get into that next.